The morning smelled like chalk and fire. June 8, 1944. 2 days after the largest amphibious invasion in human history, the Normandy countryside lay under a low gray sky. Apple orchards bent under artillery smoke. The roads were choked with wreckage, burned-out half-tracks, overturned carts. Telephone wire tangled in hedgerows like black thread ripped from a broken machine. And somewhere beneath that smoke, moving fast, moving hard, moving with a confidence that no one on the German side had fully anticipated, came the Canadians. Tanks. Dozens of them. Sherman hulls coated in mud and bramble, their engines loud enough to feel in the chest from half a mile away. The men inside had crossed an ocean to be here. Most of them were 22 years old. Some had never left Ontario. And now they were, pushing through the bocage country of France at a pace that was beginning to make German staff officers reach for their maps a second time, then a third, and ask each other a question no one had planned to ask this early in the campaign. How are they moving this fast? To understand what happened in Normandy in the summer of 1944, you have to understand what the Germans expected, not what they feared, what they expected. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had spent months reinforcing the Atlantic Wall. He believed, correctly as it turned out, that if the Allies were not stopped on the beaches within the first 24 hours, the war in the West would tilt decisively against Germany. The Wehrmacht had studied Allied capabilities with professional precision. They knew the numbers. They knew the equipment. They had read the intelligence reports about Canadian formations, the 2nd Canadian Corps, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade, and they had assessed them as capable but untested in large-scale offensive armoured operations. That assessment was not unreasonable. It was, however, catastrophically wrong. What the Germans did not fully account for was what those months of waiting and training had done to the men inside the Canadian formations. While the D-Day landings on Omaha Beach became synonymous with American sacrifice and British operations around Sword Beach dominated early press coverage. The Canadians who stormed Juno Beach on June 6th had penetrated further inland on D-Day than any other Allied formation, further than the Americans, further than the British. They had moved through resistance that should have slowed them for days, and they had done it with a precision and aggression that left German commanders in the sector genuinely scrambling. But the beach was just the door. What happened in the countryside behind it was the story. The terrain of Normandy is deceptive. On a map, it looks open. Rolling farmland, gentle river valleys, small towns connected by country roads. What the map doesn't show is the bocage. The Norman bocage is one of the most formidable defensive environments in Western Europe. Ancient earthen banks, some of them 4 and 5 feet thick, topped with dense root-tangled hedgerows that had been growing for centuries. Every field was a fortification. Every sunken lane was a kill zone. Every crossroads was a trap. Allied planners had studied the bocage. They knew it would be difficult, but the full weight of what armored operations in that environment actually meant, in terms of visibility, coordination, and the paralyzing effect on tank crews who suddenly found themselves unable to see more than 30 meters in any direction, only became real once the machines hit the ground. The standard NATO doctrine of the era called for combined arms, infantry and armor working in close coordination, each protecting the other. On paper, every Allied unit understood this. In practice, the bocage shredded those theoretical formations in the first 48 hours. American units west of the Canadian sector spent days fighting for individual fields. Some British armored columns stalled trying to coordinate movements that the terrain made nearly impossible to synchronize. The Canadians had a different problem. They moved too fast for their supply lines to keep up. Corporal Roy Booth, from Guelph, Ontario, was a tank driver with the 1st Hussars, part of the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade. In letters recovered after the war, he described the first days. After Juno, in language that was direct and unhurried, the way men who have survived extraordinary things sometimes speak when the adrenaline has finally left. He wrote that the lanes were so narrow that tank tracks sometimes scraped the bank walls, on both sides simultaneously. He wrote that the noise inside the hull was so loud during contact that communication between crew members required a kind of half-lip reading that they had developed during training and refined by necessity. He wrote that the first time they rolled over a German position rather than through it, nobody said anything for a long time afterward. What struck him most, he wrote, was not the danger. It was the speed. Nobody had told him they would be moving this fast this soon. Nobody had told him they wouldn't stop. That speed was not an accident. It was the result of a decision made months before D-Day, at a level of command far above Corporal Booth's Sherman tank, by men who had spent years thinking about exactly this problem. General Harry Crerar commanded the 1st Canadian Army. He was not a romantic. He was not the kind of commander whose name you find on the covers of paperback military histories, beside photographs of him standing in a turret looking heroic. He was methodical, careful, sometimes frustratingly deliberate in his planning, and he had spent years since the disaster at Dieppe in 1942 understanding exactly what it cost to send Canadian soldiers into combat without adequate preparation. Dieppe haunted the Canadian Officer Corps in a way that is difficult to fully articulate unless you understand what happened there. In August 1942, nearly 5,000 Canadian soldiers landed on a French beach and were cut down in a matter of hours. The planning was flawed. The intelligence was wrong. The tanks got stuck. The infantry was exposed. Almost 2,000 Canadians died or were captured in a single morning. It was the worst military day in Canadian history, and the men who survived it and the commanders who carried the weight of it forward had spent the 2 years before D-Day ensuring it would never happen again. What emerged from that trauma was something unusual in military culture, an institution that had genuinely learned. The Canadians restructured their combined arms doctrine. They trained relentlessly in coordination between armor and infantry. They studied the bocage specifically. They ran exercises in similar terrain in Britain that replicated the visual and tactical conditions of Norman hedgerow country. They refined communication procedures, developed signals protocols, and drilled the kind of instinctive small-unit cooperation that no amount of formal doctrine could mandate, but that practice and shared hardship could eventually produce. By the time they landed on Juno Beach, the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade and the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had trained together long enough that the division between the two formations was, in practice, largely administrative. In the fields of Normandy, they thought and moved as a single organism. The Germans defending the sector inland from Juno Beach included elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitlerjugend Division, composed largely of teenage volunteers, who had been indoctrinated from childhood in National Socialist ideology and trained under some of the most aggressive doctrine in the German military. They were fanatical, well-equipped, and tactically sophisticated far beyond their age. Their commander, SS Brigade Führer Fritz Witt, had positioned his division with the expectation that Allied armor would advance cautiously, probing the defensive lines and consolidating gains before pushing forward. He expected days of careful attritional fighting. He had planned for it. Instead, on June 7th and 8th, Canadian armored columns punched through his forward positions with a violence and speed that disrupted the entire defensive scheme. The problem for the 12th SS was not that they lacked the firepower to stop Sherman tanks. They absolutely had it. The problem was that by the time their anti-tank guns were positioned to engage, the Canadian armor was already somewhere else, and the Canadian infantry following behind those tanks was not waiting to consolidate. It was pressing forward, filling gaps, neutralizing bypassed positions, and denying the Germans the time they needed to reform their defensive line. This was the core of what the Canadians had developed, a tempo of operations that consistently exceeded what the enemy had planned for. In military theory, this is sometimes called operating inside the enemy's decision cycle, moving and acting faster than the opponent can observe, decide, and respond. Most armies understand the concept. Very few can actually execute it under contact in difficult terrain, with exhausted crews, limited visibility, and the constant possibility of a Panzerfaust emerging from a farmhouse window 20 meters away. The Canadians could execute it. Not perfectly, not without cost, but consistently enough to matter. The tanks themselves deserve a moment of honest accounting, because this is a story in which the machinery was both a limitation and a triumph, and understanding one without the other misses the point entirely. The Sherman tank was not the best tank in Normandy. Every soldier who fought in one knew it. The German Panther and Tiger tanks outgunned and outarmored the Sherman in almost every direct technical comparison. A Tiger could penetrate a Sherman frontally at distances where the Sherman's 75mm gun could not reliably penetrate the Tiger in return. This was not a secret. It was a problem the Allied High Command had accepted as a calculated trade-off. The Sherman was available in enormous numbers, was mechanically reliable, was simple enough to be repaired in the field by crews with moderate training, and could be shipped and landed on beaches in a way that a 60-ton Tiger never could. The mathematics of that trade-off were brutal when applied to human lives. Canadian tank crews knew the statistics. They knew that in a head-to-head engagement with a Panther, the odds were not in their favor. They knew that the term the Americans had given the Sherman, Ronson, after the cigarette lighter because it lit every time, was not entirely a joke. What the Canadians had done, partly through doctrine and partly through the bitter learning of the training period, was develop tactics that worked around the Sherman's limitations rather than pretending those limitations didn't exist. Flanking approaches, smoke, speed, coordination with infantry who could suppress anti-tank teams before the tanks were exposed to them. The use of artillery, registered and pre-planned in ways that could be called in quickly to suppress German positions before the armor advanced. They had taken a weapon that was technically inferior in certain key respects and made it operationally superior through better tactics, better coordination, and a willingness to accept that the machine was a tool, not a guarantee. By June 9th, the situation in the German command structure was beginning to develop a quality of controlled panic that the Wehrmacht's professional culture was specifically designed to suppress but could not entirely eliminate. General der Panzertruppe Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps in the sector, had been managing a crisis from the moment the first Allied reports came in on June 6th. He was a meticulous, experienced officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who had seen the Soviet armored offensives of 1943 and understood mechanized warfare at its most brutal scale. He was not easily rattled, but the pattern of Canadian movement was doing something to his staff's situational awareness that he found genuinely difficult to manage. The reports from the forward units kept arriving out of sequence. Positions that had been reported as stabilized were being hit again before reinforcements arrived. The Canadians were appearing at places the German defensive scheme had designated as secondary, then pushing hard enough there to force a reaction that inevitably weakened the primary positions. Marx reportedly told his operations officer on June 9th, that the Allied advance from the Juno sector was moving with a Schwerpunkt without a Schwerpunkt, a main effort without a single point of concentration. The Canadians were creating pressure everywhere simultaneously, and his corps lacked the mobile reserves to respond everywhere simultaneously. That observation was perceptive. It was also a summary of exactly what Canadian operational planners had intended to create. The town of Bretteville-sur-Lez would become a footnote in most histories of the Normandy campaign. But for the men of the Regina Rifle Regiment and the elements of the 6th Canadian Armoured Regiment who fought through its approaches on June 8th and 9th, it was the kind of close-range, building-to-building, hedge-to-hedge fighting that strips away all the clean language of operational planning and replaces it with something rawer and harder to describe. Sergeant John Mercer, his account is part of the Canadian War Museum's oral history collection, described moving through one particular orchard that had been converted into a German anti-tank position. He described the strange quiet before contact, the particular silence of a landscape that knows something is about to happen. The birds, he said, had stopped. He had noticed this in training and thought it was something people added to war stories. In that orchard, he realized it was simply true. The engagement that followed lasted, by his reckoning, about 11 minutes. The account he gave was precise about the sequence of events and almost clinical in its emotional register. The kind of precision that comes not from detachment, but from a mind that has processed something traumatic enough that it prefers facts to feelings in the retelling. What matters for this story is what happened after. His unit consolidated, called in the armor, and pushed forward. They did not wait for the situation behind them to be fully resolved. They moved. That movement, relentless, forward, compound, was the defining characteristic of the Canadian armored and infantry advance through the Normandy countryside. And it was beginning to change the shape of the campaign in ways that rippled far beyond the Canadian sector. Operation Windsor, which began on July 4, 1944, and targeted the town of Carpiquet and its airfield, was one of the most significant Canadian operations of the Normandy campaign and one of the least well-known outside of specialist military history. Carpiquet was not a secondary objective. The airfield adjacent to the town was, from a strategic standpoint, one of the most important pieces of terrain in the entire Normandy bridgehead. Capturing it would provide the Allies with a forward airfield capable of operating fighters and fighter-bombers in close support of ground operations, reducing the range problem that was limiting the effectiveness of Allied air cover and extending the reach of tactical air assets into the German rear. The Germans understood this perfectly. The Hitlerjugend division had turned Carpiquet into a fortress, concrete bunkers, pre-registered artillery, interlocking fields of fire covering every approach, underground tunnels connecting strong points, minefields in depth, and a garrison composed of SS troops who had been told and believed that this position would not fall. The 8th Canadian Infantry Brigade, supported by tanks of the Fort Garry, Horse and B Squadron of the 1st Hussars, went in at dawn on July 4th with naval gunfire, army artillery, and air support coordinated to suppress the German defenses in the seconds before the infantry hit the forward positions. What followed was one of the most intense small unit engagements of the Western Front. The village of Carpiquet changed hands multiple times in the course of a single afternoon. At one point, Canadian infantry held the western half of the airfield, while SS troops retained the eastern hangars, the two forces separated by a distance that could be crossed on foot in under a minute. The fighting was conducted at ranges where the difference between a rifle and a shovel was sometimes more relevant than any consideration of comparative firepower. The Canadians took Carpiquet. It cost them heavily, but they took it. It is worth pausing, briefly, on what it meant to be a young man from Canada in this landscape, because the human weight of it was not incidental to the outcome, it was directly connected to it. The men of the Canadian formations in Normandy were volunteers, almost without exception. Canada did not introduce conscription for overseas service until late in the war, and even then the implementation was politically explosive and practically limited. The men fighting in the bocage and through the Norman fields had chosen to be there, or at least had chosen the general direction of being there, which is a different psychological relationship to the experience than the one held by a conscript. This is not a small thing. The decision to volunteer for combat shapes how a person understands their own presence in a dangerous situation. It does not make them reckless. Most of the Canadians who served in Normandy were, by all accounts, quite careful men who had no romantic illusions about what bullets and artillery shells did to the human body. But it gave them a quality of purposeful commitment that showed up in the operational record as consistency under pressure, willingness to press forward when ordered to, and a capacity to absorb setbacks without fragmenting. They had come from farms in Saskatchewan and factories in Hamilton and fishing villages in Nova Scotia and French-speaking households in Quebec, where the war had been debated around kitchen tables for years before anyone put on a uniform. They were carrying something that could not be manufactured by training alone. And in the hedgerows of Normandy, against some of the most fanatically committed soldiers in the German military, that quality, earned, not issued, proved decisive. On more than one occasion, the engagement around the village of Authie on June 7th became one of the campaign's darker and more complicated chapters, and it belongs in this story because it illustrates the full cost of the Canadian advance in a way that the operational summaries alone cannot convey. North Nova Scotia Highlanders and elements of the 27th Canadian Armoured Regiment pushed forward on June 7th toward Authie and the neighbouring village of Buren in an advance that by mid-afternoon had moved well beyond the planned objectives of the day. It was aggressive movement of the kind that the Canadian doctrine encouraged, probing, forward, exploiting gaps, maintaining tempo. But at Authie, they ran into the leading elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division arriving from the south. The meeting engagement that followed was brutally one-sided. The Canadian infantry, strung out along a road with their armor unable to mass quickly enough to support them, was hit by Panther tanks and SS Grenadiers in coordinated assault. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders suffered catastrophic casualties. The survivors were captured. What happened next was a war crime. 27 Canadian prisoners of war were executed by members of the 12th SS Panzer Division in the hours and days following their capture. Shot, some of them, while still in uniform, with their hands bound or raised. The perpetrators were members of a unit that had been raised to believe that the ideological enemies of the Reich, and in their worldview, which had been shaped since adolescence to treat the Western Allies as agents of Jewish Bolshevism, were not entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention. Those 27 names were not forgotten. They were not lost in the abstraction of casualty statistics. They remained individual men from specific towns in Nova Scotia and Ontario and Manitoba, and the knowledge of what had been done to them spread through the Canadian formations in Normandy with a precision and a weight that affected the tone of the fighting that followed. It did not break Canadian discipline. It did not produce reprisals that violated Canadian military law, but it hardened something. It made the mission personal in a way that operations orders never quite can. Operation Charnwood, the Allied assault on Caen itself, began on July 8th, and the Canadian role in it was substantial. 2 divisions driving into the northern and northwestern edges of the city, in coordination with British formations, attacking from other sectors. All of them preceded by one of the most controversial decisions of the entire Normandy campaign. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder and General Bernard Montgomery had requested a heavy bomber strike on the city of Caen itself, specifically the northern Ur districts, through which the German defenders had concentrated forces and channeled their defensive preparations. The request was granted. On the night of July the 7th, nearly 500 heavy bombers dropped over 2,000 tons of bombs on a city that still contained significant numbers of French civilians who had nowhere to go. The bombing created rubble on an almost incomprehensible scale. It also, somewhat counterintuitively, created defensive advantages for the Germans. Rubble is excellent tank obstacle and can be used to channelize attacking armor into predictable routes. The Canadian and British forces advancing the morning after discovered that they were fighting through a landscape of collapsed architecture, choked roads, and civilian suffering that complicated their operational planning almost as much as it had complicated the German one. But the Canadians pushed through it. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles and the Canadian Scottish Regiment, working through streets that had been reduced to waist-high rubble fields, cleared block after block with the methodical precision of a formation that had trained for exactly this kind of fighting. Supporting tanks moved at walking pace through gaps cleared by engineers. Artillery, now able to adjust fire in real time through forward observers moving with the infantry, put shells on specific buildings before the infantry entered them. By the afternoon of July 9th, the northern districts of Caen were in Allied hands. The liberation of the rest of the city would take additional days and cost additional lives, but the Canadian performance in Charnwood demonstrated something that would define the final phase of the Normandy campaign: the capacity to fight effectively in multiple environments, to adapt doctrine in real time, and to maintain operational momentum even when the physical landscape was actively hostile to movement. The commander, who had more to do with the Canadian armored performance in Normandy than almost any other single figure, was Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, commanding the 2nd Canadian Corps. Simonds was 31 years old when the war began. He was 41 when he fought at Normandy, which means that almost everything he knew about commanding a corps-level formation in modern warfare he had learned in the years immediately preceding the campaign, through a combination of preparation, study, and the compressed education of the Italian campaign, where he had commanded the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, with results that had given him a reputation as one of the most technically capable corps commanders in the British and Commonwealth forces. He was also, by the accounts of almost everyone who served under him, difficult, demanding, impatient with subordinates who could not match the pace of his thinking, capable of a coldness about operational costs, the human costs, the casualty lists, that some found admirable as professional discipline and others found troubling as a symptom of detachment. What is not in dispute is what he produced. Simonds looked at the Normandy battlefield in mid-July 1944 and saw something that other commanders were describing as a stalemate. The Allied advance had slowed. The hedgerow country was consuming formations at a rate that was beginning to concern even Eisenhower. The question on every senior Allied commander's desk was how to break the operational deadlock that had developed in the weeks since D-Day. How to create the conditions for a breakthrough rather than grinding through the bocage at a cost that could not be sustained indefinitely. Simons's answer was Operation Totalize. Operation Totalize, launched on the night of August 7, 1944, was unlike anything that had been attempted in the Western theater of the war, and it was, in its conception and execution, a fundamentally Canadian solution to a fundamentally Canadian problem. The problem was the Falaise Road, the route south from Caen toward the town of Falaise, which was the key terrain of the entire Normandy campaign in August 1944. If the Allies could break through and capture Falaise, they would have the possibility of encircling an enormous portion of the German forces in Normandy. The kind of strategic encirclement that could end the campaign in France in weeks rather than months. The road to Falaise was defended by the 12th SS Panzer Division and elements of other German formations in positions that had been prepared and reinforced over weeks of defensive action. The terrain on either side of the main axis of advance was exactly the kind of ground that had been bleeding Allied formations since D-Day. Tight, complex, defensible. Simons's approach was, in retrospect, brilliantly unconventional. He would attack at night. Not a small night attack. A full-corps night assault, with 2 armored divisions driving south in parallel columns under artificial moonlight from searchlights aimed at the clouds, preceded by a heavy bomber strike, and conducted not with infantry walking alongside tanks, but with infantry mounted in modified armored vehicles, protected from the German defensive fire that had been stripping Canadian and British infantry off the sides of their supporting tanks for the previous 2 months. The vehicles were a piece of improvisation that deserves its own moment. Simons had noticed that the Allied forces had a surplus of self-propelled artillery vehicles, specifically M7 Priest howitzers and a shortage of armored infantry carriers. He ordered the guns removed from a large number of M7s and converted the hulls into improvised armored personnel carriers. They were, in the language of the men who rode in them, less than comfortable. The conversion was crude. There was no overhead. Protection. The interiors were cramped and smelled of machine oil and old propellant residue. The men who rode in them called them kangaroos, and on the night of August 7th, hundreds of Canadian infantry rode into battle in kangaroos for the first time in history, protected from the defensive fire that had previously made night infantry assaults catastrophically costly. The concept of the armored personnel carrier, the vehicle that would become the defining mobile warfare platform of the Cold War and all modern armored conflict, was improvised by Canadian engineers at Simons's direction in Norman Fields in the summer of 1944. The specific form it took that night, the kangaroo, was the direct ancestor of every APC that followed. The assault began at 2300 hours on August 7th. The searchlights came on first, 7 of them, aimed at the cloud ceiling, their reflected light casting the Norman countryside in a pale, flat illumination that turned shadows into hard shapes and made the landscape look like a photographic negative of itself. Then the bombers, then the artillery, then the tanks and the kangaroos, moving in columns with compressed intervals, the column commanders navigating by compass bearing and the distant glow of burning German positions. Inside the kangaroos, the infantry held on to whatever they could reach. The speed was something they had been briefed on, but were not entirely prepared for. Armored assaults at night do not wait for individual soldiers to sort themselves out. The machine decides the pace and the direction, and the humans inside it follow. The German defensive positions encountered by the lead elements of the 51st Highland Division and the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division in the first hours were caught genuinely off guard. Not all of them. The Wehrmacht's defensive capacity was never fully suppressed, but enough of them that the initial penetration went deeper than any single-night advance had achieved in the Normandy campaign to that point. By dawn, the lead Canadian elements were almost 10 kilometers south of their start line. 10 kilometers in one night, through the most heavily defended ground on the Western Front. The German response, when it came from a single source, with a specific, terrible effectiveness. SS Obersturmbannführer Michael Wittmann, the highest-scoring tank commander in history, the man who had killed over 130 Allied vehicles in his career, the man whose single Tiger tank had stopped the entire advance of the 7th Armored Division at Villers-Bocage in June, was commanding a small Tiger company in the path of the Canadian advance. On August 8th, as Operation Totalize's second phase, was developing, Wittmann moved to engage the advancing Canadian armor. The details of his final action are disputed in parts, but the central fact is not. Michael Wittmann's Tiger was destroyed that day. The crew was killed. The unit credited with killing him was a squadron of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers Regiment, a Canadian armored unit whose reputation had been built in weeks of hard fighting since D-Day. The exact shot, the exact vehicle, has been the subject of historical debate for decades. What is not debated is that the most dangerous tank commander Germany had placed in the path of the Allied advance was killed by Canadians during a Canadian operation, in a battle that the Canadians were winning. The loss of Wittmann did not stop the German counterattack on August 8th, but it removed from the battlefield the one individual who had demonstrated a consistent ability to single-handedly disrupt Allied armored advances of exactly the kind that Totalize represented. Operation Totalize ultimately did not achieve the complete breakthrough that Simons had hoped for. The second phase, which began in daylight on August 8th with a second heavy bomber strike, was disrupted when some of the bombers dropped short, killing Canadian and Polish soldiers in the assembly areas. It was one of the most devastating friendly fire incidents in Canadian military history, and it blunted the momentum at exactly the moment when momentum was most needed. The Germans reinforced. The 12th SS and elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division moved to seal the gap. The advance slowed. But it did not stop. And what it had created, a corridor driven south, a German defensive scheme disrupted, a commitment of German reserves to the Canadian sector, was about to pay a dividend that Simons had planned for, but that no one in the Canadian command had been certain would materialize. Because while the Germans were pouring their remaining mobile reserves into the path of the Canadian advance on the Falaise Road, the American formations under General George Patton's Third Army were sweeping in a wide arc to the west and south. The Falaise Pocket was beginning to close. Operation Tractable, which Simons launched on August 14th as the follow-on to Totalize, drove deeper toward Falaise with a ferocity that reflected the operational stakes. The prize was no longer just terrain. It was the possibility of trapping an entire German army group. The 4th Canadian Armored Division, driving south through positions where the German defenses were increasingly degraded by a combination of air attack, artillery, and the attrition of 2 weeks of continuous engagement, pushed hard enough that by August 16th, Canadian and Polish forces were approaching the outskirts of Falaise itself. The town fell on August 16th. The 6th Canadian Armored Regiment and elements of the South Alberta Regiment entered Falaise to find a city that had been pulverized by bombing, but that was, with notable exceptions, in Canadian hands. And then came the closing of the gap. The Falaise Pocket, as it became known, was one of the largest encirclements of the Western European campaign. Somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 German soldiers were trapped inside the closing ring formed by Canadian and Polish forces advancing from the north and American forces closing from the south. The German formations inside, the Pocket, Army Group B's remnants, the battered hulks of panzer divisions that had been fighting without pause since June, were subjected to continuous Allied air attack and artillery bombardment as they attempted to break out through a gap that narrowed by the hour. The Poles of the 1st Polish Armored Division, fighting under Canadian Corps command, made the junction with American forces at a position called the Mczuga, the Mace, in a battle that cost them enormously, but sealed the Pocket on August 19th. When the Pocket was finally closed and the fighting around it ended, the roads inside were packed with destroyed German vehicles, dead horses, abandoned equipment, and the accumulated debris of an army that had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Field Marshal von Kluge, commanding Army Group B, wrote to Hitler on August 15th that the German position in Normandy was beyond recovery. He was relieved of command the following day. He committed suicide before he could be arrested. The numbers, when they are given, carry weight without requiring embellishment. The Falaise Pocket destroyed or captured the equivalent of 10 German divisions, 50,000 prisoners, equipment losses that the Wehrmacht in the West could not replace. The road to Paris was open, but the numbers alone don't explain what happened. What happened was that a series of Canadian operations, from the beaches of Juno, through the Bocage country, through Carpiquet, through Caen, through Totalize and Tractable, had collectively broken the spine of the German defensive scheme in Normandy in a way that changed the character of the entire campaign. The speed mattered. The improvisation mattered. The armored personnel carrier, conceived in necessity and executed in days, established a doctrinal innovation that would define armored warfare for the rest of the 20th century. The night assault technique, the combination of heavy bomber, preparation with mobile armored breakthrough, the use of artificial illumination to maintain tempo, these were not accidents of circumstance. They were solutions, engineered under pressure by men who understood the problem clearly and were willing to try something that had never been tried. And beneath all of it, carrying it forward through the hedgerows and the rubble and the orchards and the darkness, were the men from Guelph and Winnipeg and Halifax and Quebec City who had crossed an ocean because they believed the thing they were doing was worth the cost. General Eberbach, commanding German Panzer Group West in the final weeks of the Normandy campaign, wrote in his post-war interrogation that the Canadian formations had exceeded every operational expectation and that their capacity for sustained offensive action at high tempo had been the single most disruptive factor in his ability to manage the defensive battle. He was not a man given to flattery of his enemies. He was a professional soldier making a professional assessment of what had happened to him, and what he concluded was that the Canadians had fought with a combination of tactical intelligence and operational aggression that the German command had not modeled in its pre-campaign planning. What he was describing, in the careful language of a staff officer conducting a post-mortem, was surprise. Not the surprise of a single ambush or an unexpected approach. Strategic, cumulative, grinding surprise. The kind that accumulates over weeks of engagement and reveals, gradually and then all at once, that the enemy is consistently capable of something you did not plan for. The last Canadian soldier, to die in the Normandy campaign died before the Falaise Pocket was fully sealed. The last German soldier to fire a weapon in organized resistance died shortly afterward. Between those two moments, 3,500 Canadians had been killed in the fighting since D-Day. Over 14,000 had been wounded. They had, in return, helped destroy an army. The road from Normandy to the Rhine was not short. The liberation of Belgium, the Battle of the Scheldt, the brutal winter fighting in the Netherlands, all of that lay ahead. And all of it would demand more of the Canadians who survived Normandy, and the Canadians who arrived to replace those who did not. The war was not over, but Normandy had changed what was possible, and the Canadians, moving fast through the countryside, pushing through the hedgerows, riding kangaroos into the searchlit dark, closing the pocket at Falaise, they had made a campaign that the German High Command had designed to hold for months, collapse in 67 days. There is a phrase that sometimes appears in operational research: the culminating point, the moment in an offensive when the attacker has used up enough of their momentum, their supplies, their casualties, that the operation can no longer continue without rest and reconstitution. Every offensive has one. The question of high command, always, is whether the culminating point comes before or after the objective is taken. The German plan for Normandy assumed the Allied culminating point would come early, that the combination of the Atlantic Wall, The bocage, the hedgerows, and the tactical capability of the Wehrmacht would exhaust the Allied offensive before it broke through into the open country beyond Caen. They were wrong. And the principal reason they were wrong was that they miscalculated the Canadians, not the equipment, not the firepower, not the strategic planning, though all of those were real and important. They miscalculated the men, their training, their doctrine, their improvisation, and their will to press forward when the situation called for it, even when the situation was dark, even when the hedgerow orchards were quiet in a way that meant something terrible was about to happen, even when the only light was the pale illumination of searchlights aimed at clouds. The world remembers Normandy through many lenses, through the American lens of Omaha and the Rangers, through the British lens of Sword and the paratroopers. Both of those stories are true and deserve their weight, but there is a version of the Normandy campaign that is told less often, in which a country of 12 million people, with no standing army at the start of the war, built a formation that fought with such competence and aggression and creative intelligence that German corps commanders used the word stunned in their operational records. That country was Canada, and the countryside of Normandy. From the beaches to Falaise, from the bocage to the rubble of Caen, bears the marks of what they did there. In the cemeteries, in the operational records, and in the doctrines of armored warfare that Canadian engineers and commanders improvised into existence in the summer of 1944, and that military forces around the world still use today. They crossed an ocean to do it. They drove fast, they improvised, and they did not stop.